Let's talk about thematic games. By thematic games, I mean games that are about the theme, rather than being about the gameplay. A good example of that would be investigation games, although there are millions of other examples and we'll cover them briefly later. There's no core play in an investigation game. Most genres are about whatever the core play of the genre is. If you play a first-person shooter game, you know what you're going to get. You're going to spend 95% of your time walking around murdering people. If you play a platformer, you're going to spend 95% of your time jumping around on platforms. You get a city builder, well, guess what? You're going to spend most of your time building cities. The play in these genres is so polished and calcified that the player already knows exactly what they're going to get. They know exactly what buttons they're going to press, exactly what menus are going to pop up, exactly what the progression is going to be like. The question is whether the devs have put in some new twist or some new layer that's fun, and that's fine. But that's not the case with a thematic game. With a thematic game, the play could be anything. There's just no rules. As an example, if you're playing a Phoenix Wright game, there's no one core play. Instead, you investigate by doing a lot of different things. You investigate by clicking around on a room. You investigate by, well, that's a terrible arrow. You investigate by looking around a map and seeing what's changed. You investigate by interviewing people and going through their dialogue trees. You investigate by showing evidence that someone is lying. And in different games, you get different mini-games added on. You investigate by reassembling pottery, or scanning for fingerprints, or rewinding videotapes, or breaking locks, or looking at people's sweat, whatever. None of these is the core play of the game. Instead, all of these exist to help to sell the player on the experience of being part of an investigation. When you play through all of these in a reasonable order, you get the feeling that you're part of an investigation. The theme has been sold. And of course, we're talking about mechanics in this case, but when we're talking about the overall play of the game, we also need to include all of the non-mechanical stuff like sound and art and writing and characterization and pacing. All of these things together sell the player on the idea that they are investigating. This is important because it's critical to understand that there is no investigation gameplay. It's very easy for indie devs like me and you to start to get kind of caught up on what the right play is. If I want to make a pet care game, what is the right play? Well, there is no right play. You want to give the impression of, caring for a pet or investigating a crime or whatever, and you can use any play that fits. There's no specific foundation. There's no rules. Let's expand just a little bit more, though. Anytime anybody tells you a story of an investigation, a narrative, it's going to be about an interesting investigation because there's no point in telling you a boring story, right? Whether it's a true crime story or just a fictional investigation, they're going to tell you about the fun ones. They're going to tell you about the ones where there's enough meat where you feel like you can get involved and feel like you're going through the investigation. And you might think that there are very specific features to that. Like, what makes an investigation narrative work? Well, maybe it's the clues that you find. How about that fingerprint? How about that spent bullet? That's not how spent bullets look, but you get the idea. How about that broken mirror that reveals that it was so-and-so or whatever? Well, that's not really a core aspect of an investigation. There are plenty of investigations where the clues are just nonsense or don't exist, but they still feel like investigations. 90% of Agatha Christie's works, the clues are garbage. You never figure out the criminal, not by actually analyzing the clues anyway. It's just something that's there to help sell you on the idea that you're participating in an investigation, that you're along for the ride. Well, how about the criminal? Who did it? Who is this criminal who murdered so-and-so or stole the such-and-such? We have to find out. That's the point of the investigation. But no, there are loads and loads of investigation stories where you already know who the criminal is from moment one. The joy of Columbo is not figuring out who did it. It's watching Columbo investigate. In fact, knowing who did it can make it more interesting because you can watch them squirm as Columbo gets closer and closer. There are no specific anchors. There's no specific rules on how you do a specific theme. If you're doing a pet care game, you might think, oh, I need to have feeding the pets as part of the game. But that's not necessary. It could be useful. All of these things could be useful. I'm not telling you to not put in clues and not put in mystery criminals. I'm saying that there are no specific rules. This is a matter of assembling all of these millions of pieces into a chain that feels right, that sells you on the idea that you're participating in an investigation or whatever your theme is. This becomes more critical when you go from a linear experience to an open world or procedural experience. Because we've been telling linear investigation stories since the dawn of time. Beowulf is an investigation story. But we don't have very much experience doing open world investigations. I mean, some people do, I'm sure, the actual investigators, but it's not really nearly as much fun as the games want to make it, right? What's the difference between a linear narrative and an open world or procedural narrative? Well, in this case, it's really critical to know the difference because it's the mechanics you use. In Phoenix Wright, there are all of these terrible little mechanics that don't really mean anything or do anything or go anywhere. Searching around a room to find evidence is an incredibly boring mechanic, right? It has no depth. The only reason the mechanic is fun is because every room is stuffed full of careful writing, and they use that careful written element to kind of make that boring mechanic last long enough to sell you on the fact that you're investigating, and then they move on. So the way that you do this in a linear story is that you have all of these mini games that you do, all of these short little bits that you do, and each one of them has just enough content that is carefully written by you to survive for the few minutes that it needs to survive. None of these mechanics have any depth. But in an open world or procedural game, story writing is incredibly difficult. You're not going to be able to create any kind of compelling story with your system. And even if you think you can, you're not going to be able to, because there's no way for a procedural story to sell you on the fact that it is important. Even if it's written well, you know that all of these characters are only going to be here for as long as it takes to solve the story, right? So you cannot rely on story elements when you're doing open world or procedural games. Now, procedural is much worse because they can't generate stories, but even open world, you can't fill the world with story beats because that would be an unimaginable amount of work. You could try to procedurally fill the world with story beats, in which case you're right back at the problem that you had with procedural content where the story beats are always going to be flat. So we cannot rely on filling our play with well-written story beats because we can't generate them. Instead, what we need to do is focus on mechanics that have some depth to them. So rather than clicking around the room to try and find the clues, we need a different mechanic. We need something that supports the idea that we're investigating, or whatever it is our theme is about, but has enough depth that the player wants to do it, even if the story is just nonsense. Now, there are a lot of solutions to this because you can just use any old element you want. As long as your gameplay supports the theme, you can use any theme you want. A good example of this would be the recent Shadows of Doubt, which is a voxel-based investigation game, and it is very janky. If you like janky games, go play it. If you hate janky games, don't. But one thing it does that you'll notice if you play it is nothing makes sense. There's no motives. There's no time. There's no opportunity. There's no reason for any of these crimes to happen. They just are, something happened. We randomly generated something that happened. Go find out who did it. All of the things that are normally in an investigation are missing. There's no interesting characters. There's no motives. There's no reason for anything to happen. But there is a series of mechanisms in the game to allow you to trace any given kind of clue. So if you find a fingerprint, you can try and go and find who the fingerprint belongs to. If you find out someone's first name, you can try and find the rest of their name by looking around. If you find where someone works, you can go to their work spot, their workplace, and look around and try and figure out where they live or whether they've stored something in their locker or something. There are a large number of actions you can take in this open world to help you trace the evidence of the crime. Even though the crime makes no sense and involves nobody interesting, the game still sells the idea that you are investigating because the play is investigating. You are running around in this world looking for clues. And now obviously the game does this in a couple of ways. There are several, half a dozen or so ways, several of which are fairly well built out. But the point here is that these methods are what the game can do. Like, the game was built to do those things, rather than having a million mini games that are, just barely content and instead rely heavily on story writing. There's just a few much heavier elements. And they give up on all the story writing and instead funnel you into these elements. And the result is quite compelling. The crimes don't make sense. Nothing makes sense. The world itself is complete nonsense. But the experience is investigation. So if you're doing a procedural or open world game, you have to reorient everything. You have to turn it around in your head and realize that all of the standards for linear storytelling can't be used here because you can't write stories. Your open world is too big, or your procedural world can't be filled with anything more interesting than pudding. Instead, you need to drive people into these mechanisms that you've created that feel like investigation. Whatever tricks you've used to make them feel like whatever your theme is, that's what you want to focus on. And this is true of more than just, investigation games. Anytime we come up with something and we're like, I really want to make a game about whatever, blimp flying, whatever, we always try and find the ideal play. But in many cases, the ideal play is something you didn't expect. Something that helps you sell the experience but doesn't have anything to do with it. If you're doing blimp flying, you might think, well, obviously, the thing that you want to have for your blimp flying game is piloting a blimp around. But piloting a blimp around is one of the most boring things possible. Blimps move very, very slowly. Instead, your blimp flying game needs to sell the experience of what it's like to fly a blimp, the high points of flying a blimp. And maybe that means that you have to talk with the customers, the passengers. Maybe that means you've got to manage your crew. Maybe that means you've got to try and stay focused and conscious for the hours that the blimp flies around without ever falling asleep at the helm. There are a ton of methods of creating an interesting blimp flying experience, and none of them involve flying a blimp. Anyway, that's my thought on the matter. Let me know what you think.